Have you ever noticed how a small change in plans can shift your entire mood, even when it shouldn't matter that much? A meeting gets moved, someone shows up late, or something doesn't happen the way you expected, and suddenly there is a tight feeling that is hard to ignore. It is not just frustration. It feels like something inside you needs to step in, fix it, and bring things back under control before it gets worse. Even when nothing is going wrong, there is still a constant need to think ahead, to plan, to make sure everything stays predictable and nothing slips out of place. It can look like responsibility from the outside, but on the inside, it often feels like pressure that never fully turns off. And the moment something becomes uncertain, that pressure quickly turns into tension. If you recognize this pattern, this video will help you understand where that need comes from and why it feels so strong. Welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives, where we explore patterns that seem personal on the surface but often have deeper roots that are easy to miss. There is a certain way this pattern shows up in everyday life, and at first it does not look unusual or extreme. It often looks like someone who is organized, responsible, and always prepared. Someone who prefers to think things through before acting and feels more comfortable when there is a clear plan. They tend to check details, confirm information, and avoid leaving things open-ended because uncertainty creates a quiet sense of unease that is hard to ignore. In daily routines, this can mean planning the day ahead in detail, thinking through possible outcomes before making even small decisions, and feeling the need to stay one step ahead of what might happen next. If something is unclear, it is not just a small inconvenience. It becomes something that keeps running in the background of the mind until it is resolved. There is a constant effort to reduce unknowns, to make things predictable, and to avoid situations where outcomes feel uncertain or out of reach. This pattern also shows up in how tasks are handled, especially when other people are involved. Delegating can feel uncomfortable, not because of a lack of trust in others as people, but because of a lack of trust in outcomes that are not directly controlled. It can feel easier to do things personally, to double-check, or to stay involved in every step, because that creates a sense of stability that is otherwise missing. Even when others are capable, stepping back can feel like taking a risk that is not worth it. In relationships, the same pattern often becomes more subtle, but more intense. There can be a tendency to anticipate problems before they happen, to think ahead about what could go wrong, and to adjust behavior in order to prevent those outcomes. This might look like trying to manage situations, guiding conversations in certain directions, or feeling uneasy when things are not clearly defined. The intention is not to control people, but to avoid situations that feel unpredictable or unstable. Over time, this way of living starts to feel normal, even necessary. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like the only way to keep things from falling apart. And the more it is repeated, the more natural it becomes, until the idea of letting go, even slightly, starts to feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable in a way that is difficult to explain. What makes this pattern important is not just how it appears in one situation, but how consistently it repeats across different areas of life, often in ways that feel automatic and difficult to turn off. It shows up in work, in daily routines, in relationships, and even in moments that are supposed to be relaxing, creating a constant background need to stay in control regardless of the setting. Over time, it stops feeling like a behavior and starts feeling like part of who the person is, even though it follows the same structure again and again. In practical terms, this often looks like overplanning that goes beyond what is actually needed, where every step is thought through in advance and multiple scenarios are considered before anything even begins. There is a tendency to check and recheck details, to confirm plans repeatedly, and to make adjustments early in order to avoid possible problems later. Even when things are already organized, there can still be a feeling that something has been missed, which leads to another round of checking or refining. This creates a loop where preparation never quite feels complete. Another clear pattern appears in the difficulty of letting others take full responsibility for tasks or decisions, even when those people are capable and trustworthy. Delegation may happen on the surface, but there is often a need to stay involved, to monitor progress, or to step in if something starts to feel uncertain. It is not driven by a desire to dominate, but by a need to ensure that outcomes stay within a predictable range. The moment something moves outside that range, the urge to regain control becomes immediate and hard to resist. This same structure extends into relationships, where control becomes less visible but more emotionally charged. There can be a habit of anticipating problems before they occur, running through possible conflicts in advance, and trying to guide situations in ways that reduce risk. Conversations may be shaped carefully, decisions may be influenced subtly, and there is often an effort to prevent misunderstandings before they even begin. While this can create short-term stability, it also means that interactions are rarely allowed to unfold naturally. Over time, this creates a repeating cycle where control leads to temporary relief, but also reinforces the belief that control is necessary in the first place. Each time something is managed successfully, it feels like proof that things would have gone wrong without that effort, even if that is not actually true. This strengthens the pattern and makes it more automatic in future situations, reducing the likelihood of trying a different approach. As this cycle continues, the threshold for what feels safe becomes narrower, and more situations start to require the same level of control in order to feel manageable. What once applied only to important decisions begins to extend into small, everyday moments, creating a constant need to stay alert and involved. At that point, the pattern is no longer tied to specific situations. It becomes a default way of responding to the world, repeating itself with very little conscious choice. At a certain point, this pattern begins to create a tension that is hard to ignore, because the same behavior that brings stability also starts to create pressure that builds over time. Control can make things feel organized and predictable, but it also requires constant attention, constant effort, and a level of mental involvement that rarely allows for rest. What starts as a way to feel safe slowly turns into something that feels necessary at all times, even when there is no clear reason for it. There is a quiet contradiction at the center of this experience, where control solves one problem but creates another at the same time. On one side, it reduces uncertainty and prevents situations from getting out of hand, which brings a sense of order and temporary relief. On the other side, it increases the need to stay alert, to keep managing, and to avoid letting things unfold without intervention, which creates ongoing tension that never fully disappears. The more control is used, the more it feels required, and the harder it becomes to step away from it. This contradiction often shows up as a persistent internal belief that is rarely questioned, but strongly felt in everyday situations. The idea can be simple and direct, something like, if I don't manage this, something will go wrong, and it can apply to many different areas at once. It may not always be expressed in words, but it influences decisions, reactions, and levels of comfort in a very consistent way. Even when there is no evidence that something will fail, the feeling remains strong enough to drive behavior. As a result, relaxation becomes difficult in a very specific way, not because there is always something urgent happening, but because there is always something that could happen if attention is lowered. Letting go does not feel neutral, it feels risky, as if stepping back even slightly could allow problems to appear or grow unnoticed. This creates a situation where rest is not just about stopping activity, but about facing a sense of uncertainty that feels uncomfortable and sometimes unsafe. Over time, the emotional cost of this pattern becomes more visible, even if it is not immediately connected to the need for control. There can be fatigue from constantly thinking ahead, frustration when things do not go as planned, and a subtle sense of pressure that remains present even during calm moments. In relationships, it can create distance, because others may feel managed rather than trusted, even if that was never the intention. Internally, it can feel like carrying responsibility not just for actions, but for outcomes that are impossible to fully control. What makes this tension especially difficult is that it does not have a clear stopping point, because the system that creates safety is also the system that prevents letting go. Control keeps things stable, but it also keeps the mind engaged in a way that sustains the very tension it is trying to reduce. And without understanding where this pattern comes from, it can feel like this is simply how things have to be, even when it starts to take more energy than it gives back. At this point, the pattern starts to make more sense when we look at it through a different lens, one that focuses not just on present behavior, but on where that behavior might come from. In the work of Edgar Cayce, patterns like this were often described as responses that did not begin in the current life, but were carried forward from earlier experiences that left a strong emotional imprint. These were not random traits, but adaptive responses that once had a clear purpose in a very different context. Cayce described many cases where individuals had lived through situations marked by instability, sudden change, or complete loss of control, where events unfolded in ways that could not be predicted or managed. These could include environments shaped by conflict, collapse, or unexpected disruption, where safety depended not on planning, but on reacting to conditions that shifted without warning. In those contexts, the absence of control was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous, and the experience of that danger could leave a lasting imprint on the deeper levels of memory. From this perspective, the need for control in the present can be understood as a continuation of that earlier experience, even if the current life does not contain the same level of threat. What once served as a way to survive becomes a way to feel safe, even when the environment has changed and no longer requires the same level of vigilance. The pattern remains active because it was effective before, and the system that learned it does not easily recognize that the conditions are now different. This is where the behavior starts to shift in meaning, from something that looks like preference or personality into something that functions as protection. The constant planning, the difficulty with uncertainty, and the need to manage outcomes are not just habits. They are ways of preventing a return to a state that once felt overwhelming or uncontrollable. Even if that state is not consciously remembered, the response to it continues to operate in the background, shaping how situations are interpreted and handled. What makes this especially important is that the protective response does not turn off automatically when it is no longer needed. It continues to run as if the original conditions are still present, applying the same level of control to situations that may not require it. This creates a mismatch between the intensity of the response and the actual level of risk, which can make everyday life feel more demanding than it needs to be. The system is still solving a problem, but it is solving a problem that may no longer exist in the same form. Seen in this way, the need for control is not something to judge or label as excessive, but something to understand as a response that once had a clear function. It is a form of protection that has stayed active beyond the context in which it was first created, continuing to shape behavior in ways that can feel necessary even when they are no longer aligned with the present moment. When you step back and look at this pattern more broadly, it becomes clear that this is not limited to a small group of people, but something that appears in many different forms across a wide range of experiences. The need to stay in control shows up in different intensities, from subtle habits of planning and checking to more visible patterns of anxiety and constant monitoring. But the underlying structure often follows the same logic. It is a response built around reducing uncertainty in order to feel safe. In many cases, this pattern overlaps with what is commonly described as anxiety, especially when the mind begins to focus on possible future outcomes and tries to prepare for them in advance. The constant scanning for what could go wrong, the effort to stay ahead of potential problems, and the discomfort with situations that cannot be predicted all reflect the same core mechanism. Control becomes a way to manage that uncertainty, not by removing it completely, but by creating the sense that it is being handled. This is also closely related to coping mechanisms that develop over time as a way to deal with stress or instability. When a certain behavior reduces discomfort, even temporarily, the mind tends to repeat it and strengthen it through repetition. Planning more, checking more, and staying involved in every detail can create short-term relief, which reinforces the idea that these actions are necessary. Over time, the behavior becomes automatic, even when the original reason for it is no longer present in the same way. What makes this pattern widespread is that it does not require extreme circumstances to develop, but can grow gradually through repeated experiences of uncertainty or situations where outcomes felt out of reach. Different people express it differently, some becoming highly structured and detail-focused, others becoming more mentally preoccupied with anticipating outcomes, but the underlying drive remains consistent. It is the attempt to create stability in a world that does not always offer it naturally. When viewed across different individuals and situations, the pattern becomes easier to recognize not as a personal flaw, but as a common human response that can take many forms. It is not limited to one type of personality, and it does not mean something is wrong with the person experiencing it. Instead, it reflects a deeper system that is trying to maintain a sense of safety using the tools it has learned, even if those tools sometimes create new forms of pressure over time. When we translate this pattern into modern psychological terms, it becomes easier to see how the same mechanism can be understood without relying on past life language, while still pointing to the same underlying process. In psychology, this is often described as a learned response shaped by the brain's need to reduce uncertainty and maintain a sense of safety. When something feels unpredictable, the brain does not stay neutral. It tries to regain stability as quickly as possible. One of the key systems involved in this process is the part of the brain that constantly scans for potential threats and evaluates whether a situation is safe or not, even when there is no obvious danger. When uncertainty is interpreted as risk, the body responds with tension, increased attention, and a push toward action that can reduce that uncertainty. Planning, organizing, and controlling outcomes become ways to signal to the system that things are under control, which helps lower that internal tension, at least for a short time. Over time, this creates a loop between behavior and emotional response, where control reduces discomfort in the moment, which reinforces the behavior and makes it more likely to be used again in the future. The brain learns that control equals safety, not because it is always true, but because it has worked often enough to become the preferred strategy. As this loop repeats, the threshold for what feels uncertain becomes lower, and more situations begin to trigger the same response. This is also closely connected to how conditioning works, where repeated experiences shape automatic reactions without the need for conscious decision-making. If uncertainty has been paired with discomfort enough times, even neutral situations can start to feel uneasy, simply because they are not fully predictable. The response does not require a clear reason in the present moment. It is driven by patterns that have been built over time and stored in the background of the mind. From this perspective, the need for control is not about personality or preference, but about how the nervous system has learned to respond to certain types of situations. It is a system trying to protect itself using strategies that have been reinforced repeatedly, even if those strategies are no longer the most effective or necessary in the current environment. Understanding this does not remove the pattern immediately, but it does change how it is interpreted, from something that feels fixed and personal to something that can be observed, understood, and eventually adjusted. At the center of this pattern, there is a simple idea that changes how everything else is understood once it becomes clear. The need for control is not a fixed personality trait, and it is not something that defines who a person is at their core. It is a response that has been learned, repeated, and reinforced over time because it once served a purpose. When this is seen clearly, the focus shifts away from labeling the person as controlling and toward understanding what the behavior is trying to achieve. In most cases, that behavior is trying to create a sense of safety in situations that feel uncertain or unpredictable, even if those situations are not actually dangerous. The mind is not trying to dominate or restrict. It is trying to prevent a return to a state that once felt unstable or overwhelming, using the tools it has learned to rely on. Control becomes a way of managing internal discomfort, not just external outcomes, which is why it feels so necessary even in small or everyday situations. This changes the way the pattern is interpreted, because instead of seeing it as something that needs to be removed or judged, it can be seen as something that needs to be understood and gradually adjusted. The behavior is not random, and it is not irrational in the way it may appear on the surface. It follows a consistent logic based on past reinforcement. Once that logic is recognized, it becomes possible to question whether the same level of control is still required in the present moment. It also opens the possibility of separating identity from behavior, which is an important shift that reduces unnecessary pressure. A person is not their pattern, and the presence of this pattern does not mean that it has to remain unchanged. It simply means that a certain response has been practiced often enough to become automatic, and like any learned response, it can be observed, interrupted, and gradually reshaped over time with awareness and consistency. Seen in this way, the need for control becomes less about who someone is, and more about what their system has learned to do in order to feel safe. And once that distinction is clear, it becomes easier to approach the pattern with a sense of understanding rather than resistance, which is the first step toward creating a different way of responding. At this point, it may be helpful to pause for a moment and look at this pattern in a more personal way, not as a concept, but as something that might be present in your own experience in small or familiar forms. The need to stay in control often feels justified in the moment, because it is tied to preventing something from going wrong. But the deeper question is not about what you are controlling. It is about what you are trying to avoid. If everything needs to be planned, checked, and managed, what are you making sure does not happen again, even if you do not think about it directly? What kind of situation would feel unacceptable if it unfolded without your involvement? And why does that situation carry so much weight? These questions are not meant to create pressure or force an answer, but to bring attention to something that usually stays in the background. Sometimes the pattern becomes clearer, not when you try to change it immediately, but when you begin to notice when it activates and what it is responding to in that moment. And from there, a different kind of understanding can begin to form, one that does not rely on control as the only way to feel stable. What we explored today is not just a behavior, but a pattern that often runs quietly in the background, shaping how situations are handled and how safe or unsafe they feel. The need for control is easy to misunderstand, especially when it looks like responsibility or discipline on the surface. But when you look deeper, it often connects to something much more personal and long-standing. And once you begin to see it that way, it becomes easier to approach it with awareness instead of reacting to it automatically. If this pattern feels familiar to you, take a moment to notice where it shows up most clearly in your life. Not to fix it right away, but simply to understand it a little better each time it appears. That awareness alone can begin to change how you respond over time, in ways that feel more natural and less forced. If you found this video helpful, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing to Edgar Cayce Narratives. And if there is something in this topic that you are still thinking about or want to understand more clearly, leave a comment below. You can also share other patterns or questions you would like to explore in future videos.